Our guest tonight has been a reporter for nearly 50 years. For the last 45, he's been covering the ups and downs of federal politics from the nation's capital. Laurie Oakes is known for his scoops. Probably the biggest one was in 1980 when he revealed then Treasurer John Howard's budget speech before he delivered it to Parliament. Since then, the Nine Network's political editor has achieved critical and popular recognition for his craft. He's won several Walkley Awards and been inducted into the Logies Hall of Fame. Remarkable Times is the title of his most recent book, a collection of Laurie's columns from the past 3 years, seeking to explain one of the most tumultuous times in Australian politics. Laurie Oakes, welcome back to The Drum.
Thanks, Dave.
Now, your book covers the 3 years in which you say things became nastier and more personal inside and outside of Parliament. Can we now seal off that little 3-year period, or has politics changed forever in Australia?
Well, I think that the nastiness, the personal bitterness will be hard to get rid of. We'll get an idea next week, I think, and a lot will depend on Tony Abbott and how he behaves as Prime Minister, and Bronwyn Bishop and how she behaves as Speaker. It's going to be tough, I think, to put this back into the bottle. Politics really has been, I think, particularly nasty and poisonous, and it's got a lot to do, I think, with things like the internet. That's not going to go away. The internet, particularly Twitter, is regarded as an enabler of anger, and that stirs up the whole political scene, I think, and that affects politicians. It affects the media. The media has been a part of all this as well. We've contributed to the general nastiness. I think it's going to be very hard to go back to where we were.
In a column you wrote in 2010, you said in comparison to American politics, Australians, thank goodness, are still pretty sane when it comes to politics. Can you say that now with the same certainty that you did back then?
No, and I couldn't say it a year later with any certainty either, because this did change in Australia over the space of 3 years. The full impact of the internet hit. That brought out a lot of the sort of people on the fringe, got them involved. The shock jocks of the world stirred it up, and suddenly we were looking like America. You only have to look at some of the really nasty, horrible signs that were carried by some of the demonstrators, about Julia Gillard, to ditch the witch and Bob Brown's bitch, all that sort of horrible stuff. That was straight out of the mad American wingnut playbook, and suddenly it was here in Australia. So when I wrote that column, it hadn't really hit Australia, but within a year it was here with a vengeance.
Joh Bjelke-Petersen famously used to refer to his press conferences as feeding the chooks, but it looks like so far Tony Abbott's policy is more starving the chooks. Joe Hockey today defended the PM's lack of media conferences so far by saying that he was flat out running the country. Is that fair enough?
Oh, look, Tony Abbott is flat out running the country, as is any Prime Minister. And I think Tony Abbott is right to try and get a grip on the news cycle and try and overcome the problems that it automatically entails. At the moment, where there are no deadlines anymore, with newspapers in difficulty, either no deadlines or a deadline every nanosecond, whichever way you want to look at it, the media has speeded up, politics has speeded up, politicians are supposed to be out there all the time replying to stuff, providing stories for journalists. Now, that is a recipe for bad government. Tony Abbott's right to try and bring it under control. Julia Gillard tried and failed. In England, David Cameron tried, and he admitted to the Leveson inquiry that he'd failed because, as he said, no government can really let a whole lot of bad damaging stories go past without responding. So this is a difficult problem. Tony Abbott is trying to deal with it. But I think he's gone overboard. What I've particularly written about is Scott Morrison's attitude, the Immigration Minister, where he has a press conference every week now, where basically his attitude is, you journalists keep getting things wrong, but don't come to my department asking for the truth or trying to check stuff, because that's not our job. So what he's saying is he'll let the voters be misled by allowing erroneous stuff to appear in the media, because he doesn't think the government has any responsibility to provide accurate information. That's the kind of thing I'm criticising.
OK, but when there is a vacuum, it tends to be filled in one way or another. Do you think the fact that there's less media conferences will mean that journalists will go and be more creative, start working contacts and go and cover stories less based on what the Prime Minister or his ministerial team is feeding and more on original reporting?
Well, I don't think they'd ever stopped, and you only have to look at the embarrassing stories that helped bring the Gillard government into disrepute to know that. Journalists don't rely on handouts, although it's becoming increasingly difficult for a lot of them because there are fewer journalists now with the newspapers in trouble and business models breaking down. So there are fewer journalists chasing more news, if you like. It's becoming a harder job. People are working harder, but they're doing their best. They're not relying on handouts, and that's just insulting.
Ray?
Laurie, do you think this stop the world I want to get off attitude in terms of 24-hour news, can Tony Abbott really do that once Parliament comes back in sitting? And if he does that, we know that 24-hour news is going to be filled with opinions from journalists, if not from ministers.
Yeah, look, it's not just journalists who appear on the 24-hour news. Politicians appear on programs like this. They appear on News 24 all day. They appear on Sky News all day. You can't not send your people out. And that happened yesterday, for example, when Jamie Briggs had to talk about a couple of the running issues, and including the expenses scandal and the GrainCorp foreign ownership row between the Nationals and the Liberals. So there are politicians out there all the time. I think what the problem is that Tony Abbott's not sending the ministers out there. For example, the expenses scandal, you should have your Special Minister of State, Senator Ronaldson, out there defending. He hasn't been cited. So backbenchers have got to do it, and that's a recipe for a disaster, I think, in terms of the government's image.
What's the middle ground then, Laurie? If in fact politicians have to fill some of those endless 24 hours, obviously Tony Abbott wants to keep control. What's the middle ground? They go out there and be a little more careful.
Yeah, the middle ground is to be more judicious in the way you enter the news cycle, if you like. It is true that Kevin Rudd wanted an announcement every 10 minutes. So you can't operate like that. You can't govern the country like that. You do have to be more judicious, which is what Tony Abbott wants to do. But you can't solve the problem just by cutting off ministers, telling them they can't go out and defend or explain government policy. It won't work, nor can you allow a scandal to build up without sending someone in authority out to try and nip it in the bud. That's how the MP's expenses scandal got rolling. It's now been going virtually since the election. It could have been stopped right on day one if Tony Abbott or the Special Minister of State had said, look, we'll look at this, it's obviously a problem, we're a new government, and we'll look at the problem and find a way to deal with it. It would have been all over.
John, what have you thought of the media strategy so far?
Well, I can understand what Tony's trying to do, which is depoliticise the politics, and I agree with what Laurie's saying. I mean, somehow the game of politics is destructive of good government. How do you do it, Laurie? How do you make the step back? I mean, you say being more judicious in your access to the media or your supply of information to the media, but what is it that Abbott can do that can get him across the line when Cameron and Gillard and others have failed decisively in trying to do it?
Well, I think firstly, you avoid the sort of the goading and the arrogance of Scott Morrison, where he just pours mullock on journalists. But by doing that, you're saying you don't care if the voters are informed or not. You can't do that. That's as I said yesterday, that's disgusting, that attitude. So what they've got to do is try and have their case put in a controlled way. I mean, you don't have 58 people out there every day, chirping away on the same subject. You send your ministers out there or someone with authority, and you deal with it. You can't leave the field to the enemy. But you don't have to do a Kevin Rudd either. You don't have to have an announceable every 10 minutes. There is a middle way, and that, I think, is probably what Tony Abbott is striving for. But at the moment, he's gone a bit far, I think.
Sue?
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how this strategy survives actually through this session of Parliament in the day-in, day-out play. And, Laurie, I totally agree with you. I mean, the previous governments, if you like, whatever form we want to talk about the last 7 years, we're talking about, the fly crawling up the wall. I mean, I've got a very noted Australian photographer, Ray Martin, beside me, and I remember a particular Prime Minister waiting on the work of another photographer, and it's kind of, there's some things that politicians should actually show some smarts and avoid. So I think, you turn off the tap, but you still talk about the matters of government. Can I change subject ever so slightly, Steve, without getting into too much trouble? Women in politics, women in business has been a hot issue for some time, and I think, it's amazing the smarting and the hurt that is still around and the anger that is still around by the choice of only having one woman in cabinet. And yes, there are women in the outer cabinet, very few parliamentary secretaries. It seems to have really hit a chord with a lot of people. Do you think that's a passing issue, or do you think that's a scar that he'll bear for a while?
I think it's a scar he'll bear for a while. Tony Abbott already had the so-called woman's problem. He'd spent a lot of time and involved his wife and his daughters and his senior advisor, his chief of staff, to prove that he did believe that women had a prominent place there alongside men, and that he wasn't the old-fashioned Tony everyone thought he was. Well, now he's got that problem again. It is ridiculous to think that there is only one woman in the Liberal Party in Parliament who's fit for a cabinet post. It's certainly ridiculous that someone with the talent of Kelly O'Dwyer is still there on the backbench. I mean, there's no excuse for that. So I think that Tony Abbott will bear the scar for a while. He's got to do something about it. I hope he knows that.
Laurie, I'm curious, you mentioned you dipped your toe in and then pulled back again in terms of journalists in Canberra, what they should be doing. I can remember when, Back to the Future again, when you first came through with Paul Kelly and so on to Washington, and sitting there as you forensically cut up one of the Undersecretaries of State over a Vietnam policy, and I thought then how much tougher the Australian journos were to the American journalists, and they certainly are. I wonder whether you, as the sort of senior spokesman there, whether you think if the government's going to pull back and change attitude towards the press, whether the press should also change attitude.
Well, I think we've got to be tough. Apart from anything else, I think the Labor Party is going to be demoralised for a long while. It won't be an effective opposition for a while. And when they sit down in the opposition benches for the first time next Tuesday, I mean, you'll see a lot of hangdog expressions. So I think the press has a role that's even more important in that sort of climate. We do need to be tough. We do need to hold the government to account. We do need to ask tough questions. And when people like Scott Morrison give us the finger when we ask tough questions, we've got to shine a light on that and expose it, because it's not acceptable. It doesn't matter about the journalists. They're not important. But the journalists are there representing the public and reporting to the public. And that's what matters.
Laurie, do you think that Tony Abbott can make the transition from being the most effective opposition leader in recent history to being an effective Prime Minister?
Yeah, I do. I think that Tony Abbott has shown amazing self-discipline. He transformed himself in the space of a few months towards the end of that hung Parliament, from there to the election, from being the negative politician, relentlessly negative, the abominable no man. And by the end of the campaign, it was Kevin Rudd who was the negative leader, and Tony Abbott was the sober, responsible, positive person promising methodical, reliable government. Look, Tony Abbott is a very clever politician. He's repositioned himself very well, and I think as long as he listens to his advisers and doesn't get too cocky, I think he could turn out to be an effective Prime Minister. I think he's certainly got the ability to do it.
You point out in the book, though, that all political careers end in tears. Yeah. What are the potential pitfalls facing him?
Well, the potential pitfalls are eventually either the public get sick of him and throw him out, or his colleagues will become ambitious and they'll throw him out. That's what usually happens.
Or his tongue.
If you're Kevin Rudd, of course, they both happen to you. You get the double.
But doesn't that then perhaps lend credence to his media strategy at the moment of not letting the public get sick of him by just withdrawing a little bit? Of course, Kevin Rudd and I think even John Howard towards the end of his prime ministership, people got sick of them because they were almost overexposed.
Well, it's certainly the case with Kevin Rudd, I think, and perhaps with John Howard. I think when you get Prime Ministers coming out and talking about who won the cricket and what tactics our football team should use, that's getting ridiculous. And Tony Abbott's refused to play that game, and more power to his elbow. I think that's certainly true. But I think the public will get sick of a Prime Minister who treats them with contempt as well. I don't think Tony Abbott can afford to thumb his nose at the public over their right to know. At the moment, people have had too much of politics over the last 3 years. They want a break. But that won't last because it's too important. And they will expect Tony Abbott to inform them. They'll expect him to allow his ministers to inform them. And if that doesn't happen, then he'll pay the price.
Laurie, we'll have to leave it there, but thanks so much for coming on The Drum.
Pleasure.
Laurie Oakes, and his book is called Remarkable Times. And that is all for The Drum for tonight. Thanks very much to our panel, John Hewson, Sue Cato and Ray Martin.